Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors patron family. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors Patreon community to instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and to take part in a member-only book club. They can also enter patron-only monthly giveaways, to name but a few of the perks. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome back Brooke Little to the show to talk about death songs, funeral music, and execution ballads. Brooke is a PhD candidate in musicology at Northwestern University who specialises in Tudor queens, music education and music performance at the 16th century English court. She holds a BM in voice performance, MME in vocal music education, both from the University of Missouri, Columbia, as well as an MM in musicology from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her thesis, entitled The Musical Education and Involvement of the Six Wives of Henry VIII, focuses on questions of gender, sexuality, female education and performance in the first half of the English 16th century. You can find Brooke on Instagram at Lady Tudor Music. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Brooke. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm well. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I'm really excited about it. So we're going to be discussing something a bit different to other episodes that I've done. So basically what we know of the musical events of each of the death or burials of each of the six queens, so Henry VIII's wives. So let's just start. Do you want to start talking about Katherine of Aragon, perhaps?
Yeah. Before we kind of dive into Katherine of Aragon, I thought I kind of give a little bit of an overview because there's so many dynamic shifts that happen just with the funerals themselves between Katherine of Aragon to Katherine Parr. We kind of meander through this uber Catholic ceremonial procession, ricochet with Katherine Parr's funeral to the first Protestant funeral ever, and then kind of come on back with Anne of Cleves in 1557 and kind of doing it by the books under Mary I. So Katherine of Aragon, I'll just go ahead and read a bit. There's not a terrible amount of musical information, like many of the other processions that followed her queenship. I think that the ceremony kind of gets a bit overshadowed by, in this case, the funeral of Jane Seymour, which I kind of envision as that being the way it should have been, almost, with how much detail's given in some of the chronicles. But I was so struck by, in preparing for today, I read through quite a bit of the letters and papers, and I was so struck by how much back and forth there was about her funeral correspondence, and there was so much controversy surrounding it. But musically speaking, we have the only thing that's really mentioned besides a mass, just a general mass, is something that's called a dirige, or we think of it today as a dirge, which is, it can be a standalone piece or this kind of lament for the dead like we think of today, but it can also be part of a mass, and there's actually a Josquin de Pré mass dirige, or a dirge mass, that is quite lengthy, and it could have possibly been something that they might have used to celebrate her soul departing the earth in that manner. But yeah, musically speaking, she has the least amount of detail.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Considering, of course, how long she was on the throne for. But of course, when we consider the circumstances of her fall and her death and everything, it kind of makes sense. And I totally agree with you. I remember when I was looking at letters and papers and looking at the correspondence about her funeral as well, I suppose I shouldn't have been struck by it, but I was, how Henry was, until the very end, of course, saying, well, she wasn't his actual wife, but, what can I get of her property anyway? So, he was double standards, right, with Henry?
Right. And I was also really struck by, so she requests, one of her things that she requests in her final will and testament is for 500 masses to be sung for her soul. And of course, Henry doesn't allow that to happen. But with Jane Seymour's, he orders for 1,200 masses for her soul to be said. So it's almost like he's continuing to musically denigrate or punish her even in death, and kind of almost unintentionally or intentionally asking for her soul to remain longer in purgatory. So
that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I've never thought of it from that perspective. Yeah. So what about Anne Boleyn, of course, another controversial end there. So what did you discover about her death and burial in terms of music?
Musically speaking, there's obviously a lot of myth and legend that goes on there, but there's no musical evidence whatsoever of any kind of music associated with her funeral or tossing into the arrow chest at all. But I think a bit later we'll kind of touch on "Oh Death, Rock Me to Sleep," but they didn't play that at her funeral, or as they were kind of that would have been too perfect, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of those myths that we sort of, I think people would have liked there to have been something to mark, the death of such an extraordinary woman. But sadly, the evidence just points to there having been nothing really. So that's really interesting. And then we'll come back to her death.
Yeah.
So Jane Seymour, I think this is where we're going to get some detail.
Right. And I had to there are several different types of what are called requiem masses. So there is a requiem aeternam mass, and that's kind of the final one said over one's, or sung rather, over one's soul during the burial. But leading up to that point, there's almost 12 days of masses being sung. And there's different types of masses that are being sung during that time. So in the mornings, I believe, during matins is what's called the dirge, or the dirge again. There's a dirge singing. And then the evening, there's something called a placebo being sung. And that's where actually we get the word placebo. It's from the placebo singing, or placebo singers, of this antiphon over the dead being sung at Vespers during the office of the dead. And so we would have had that every day, as well as a dirge being sung every day, as well as more than likely a high mass or a requiem mass being sung every day. And so if you think about it, it's probably hundreds of choir and musician personnel having to work for this almost 2-week span just to celebrate Jane Seymour's death.
And did this take place at Hampton Court, the chapel? Is this where she's laying in state there?
Correct. Yes, there. And then upon her removal to Windsor Castle, there's this other aspect which is really interesting of the bells, a doleful bell being rung. And there's this kind of medieval belief in early modern England that bells actually can ward off evil spirits, and that goes with christenings and celebratory bells, kind of warding off demonic forces against a baby. But for a corpse, it's kind of helping the soul find its way to purgatory just a bit faster as the body is processing. So that's really interesting too, is that there's all this talk of the doleful bells also being rung with these horses draped in black velvet. And it's just this fabulous, fantastic kind of thing.
Goodness, I've never heard of that. That's really, really interesting. Did you want to say anything else about Jane?
I mean, Jane has, I think of the account of Jane's funeral procession, much like we might read or interpret the Chronicle of Anne Boleyn's coronation. It's that detailed. And Jane's funeral is it's almost a stand-in for her own coronation, with how dramatic and charismatic the music is, as well as she's laid in state in cloth of gold and even crowned. So it's almost the coronation she didn't get to have, or the coronation that Henry's henrifying to the people that this was your queen, So
yeah, that's another really interesting point. I wonder if he did, well, I don't actually think Henry felt guilt, but if he was a normal person, I wonder if he did feel a little guilty that she didn't get her coronation and she provided him with the longed for male heir. That's really interesting.
Yeah, but this recording and this timeline is so poignant because we are on that anniversary of that in between the birth of Prince Edward and her death. And so October 1537 would have been an incredibly dramatic and dynamic sonic month in Tudor England. So you're going from these celebratory bells and celebratory gunfire and the trumpets blasting almost in her face as it happens in Hampton Court with the christening procession, going from that to this complete 180 shift musically and celebrating not only her contribution to the crown, but also celebrating her life with all these incredibly elaborate musical celebrations of her death.
Again, that's really interesting because you're completely right. There would have been all the celebrations for Edward's birth and, the court in this sort of high state and then suddenly plummeted to this state of mourning, this terrible state of mourning. So it's really interesting to think about what that would have been like for the people that were there.
Yeah, and I almost transitioning to integrating silences with her death too. I imagine there would have been, a very solemn mood, and that along with that goes silence, as well as those kind of singular sounding or tolling of just the doleful bell. There would have been quite a bit of room for quiet in between the masses that would have been sung in these sacred spaces also.
Now, although Jane is the one that, of course, provided the heir finally, Anne of Cleves, of course, is the only one that is in fact buried at the high altar at Westminster Abbey in this very privileged position that Mary I kind of allowed her to be buried at. So what about Anne, her burial at Westminster? And I know there are some primary sources about her burial. So what about the musical elements there to do with her death?
About, 7 years ago, I was doing a bit of research at the British Library, and I came across one of the Egerton manuscripts, the Egerton MS 2642, which talks about there's a 16th century Latin interpretation of the events surrounding her funeral. And one of the really interesting things that isn't discussed in the later kind of 17th century accounts of her funeral is that in this Egerton manuscript, there's several mentions of a noble choir of men in this manuscript, and then also the singing of solemn psalms. And so that could be things like what we've talked about before, the dirge or a placebo, or even at times they might have integrated what's called a De Profunctis, which is a hymn for the dead, or it could also be the singing of psalms in that too. So it's really a very cool document. And I keep coming back to this manuscript over time. So Anne of Cleves, actually, I know I did kind of mention that Jane Seymour's funeral account is quite grand and quite prolific, but we do get a bit more of a play-by-play with Anne of Cleves in some of the later, almost secondary sources that, again, we discussed. There was a dirge that was performed. And this one is the account of Anne of Cleves is really interesting because it's the only one to mention specifically performing a requiem mass. And so that sounds very, very Mary I to me, doing everything by the book. So I imagine there must have been some kind of taverner or a Fairfax mass requiem performed, some of these early Henrician composers that Mary definitely tries to kind of bring back into the public consciousness of the time.
It might be worth just mentioning for anyone listening, because I know that lots of people have been to Westminster Abbey and then leave kind of saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea Anne of Cleves was buried there, because it's so easy to miss it, isn't it?
Right.
So maybe just for anyone listening, next time you're there, when you're looking at the high altar, on the right is where Anne of Cleves is buried. But if you sort of jump onto the other side, because you can't obviously go onto the high altar, on the other side is where you'll see her name, Anne of Cleves. So it is easy to miss, but try and have a look at it and pause there for a moment if you can, because like I say, this is an incredibly privileged position. I think she's buried quite close to, I want to say, Anne Neville. But, if they're not marked, it's so easy to miss, of
Right.
course. And everyone heads straight for Elizabeth's tomb, don't they, in the great Tudor chapel. So,
Yeah, I believe on the high altar side, there's kind of what looks to be almost a duplicate of the panels that are at Hever Castle that has
exactly.
her symbol on it.
And of course, her successor, Katherine Howard, well, she, met a terrible end as well, a very controversial end. So did you find much about the music associated with her death, or is it just a matter of, well, when you're charged with high treason, there's not going to be very much?
Right. Not too much pomp or circumstance, unless you could somehow, as we kind of touched on, associate bringing the block to her chamber to practice as some kind of, timed rehearsal. I mean, mostly that's just sad and, extra creepy for the listeners for this October listening. So.
Exactly. That always breaks my heart, that story, actually, thinking of, we don't know exactly her age, but, we think she was probably teenager still, which
Right.
is awful, thinking of her practicing. And of course, because people at the time want to make this good end, don't they? They
Right.
want to, end in a way that's, well, especially because she was queen as well. She's probably trying to make this her final performance. Really, you're right. So she's
Yeah,
rehearsing for this.
you're right. And there is this almost a script for execution speeches and performance on the scaffold, and that willingness and wanting to die well. So I think it speaks well of her character that she wanted to practice, even though it's awful. So
You're right, actually, because she does, she's often portrayed as this sort of flighty girl
right.
that didn't really take anything seriously. And I think that is really unfair, to be honest. And I think we see
I
with her
agree.
very courageous end,
Right.
meeting such an awful end with such courage, that she, of course, was made of much more substance. And yes, I think people find it hard to think, how do people just accept and stand on the scaffold and say, wish the king well type thing. But of course, as you say, there was a set script that you were
Right.
expected to conform to. If not, of course, you're leaving behind friends and families that will be punished for it, right?
Correct. And it's a standard cultural practice for the time, as well as you have an audience. So
Sure is. And that's why, importantly, just as a side note, when people divert from it even slightly, like
yeah.
Anne Boleyn did in hers, by not acknowledging her fault, it's it speaks volumes of
Really
what's
does.
happened in that particular situation. All right. So what about Katherine Parr? I think you mentioned this is the first Protestant funeral.
One thing that's really, really fascinating about Katherine Parr's funeral is that this is the very first funeral to have musical selections performed in English. So they perform, and the type of piece that they perform is a Te Deum, which normally is used for very celebratory occasions previously, but they perform a Te Deum in English. And more than likely, it is performed in unison. So we're going from these kind of super polyphonic, very complicated, ornate musical pieces to a very simplified piece performed in English that's emphasizing the text. So it's almost like going from the stained glass windows of Sainte-Chapelle to just a plain pane of glass out musically. So very, very fascinating. I think they did a reenactment of her funeral at Sudeley in 2012, I believe it was.
Yeah, they did. Now that you mentioned it, I remember also they set up the room where they had like Katherine Parr lying down, and I think it was Lady Jane Grey that was chief mourner,
Right.
I believe,
Yes.
standing by her bedside. It was very moving, actually.
Yeah, that's Lady Jane Grey. That is an interesting, I knew that, but that's an interesting fact, isn't it? Who plays chief mourner where Lady Mary at Jane Seymour's, and it was the Duke of Suffolk's oldest daughter, who I cannot remember her name, that was the chief mourner at Katherine of Aragon.
Friends, you're right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So really interesting how it's all these kind of great ladies performing as chief mourner, and they have to attend all of the masses also. So
would have been a lot to attend to, I'm sure.
A lot of yes, a lot of masses to listen to.
All right. Well, let's briefly return to or touch on the death of Queen Jane. So that's a ballad, and maybe tell us what that piece might tell us about the circumstances of Prince Edward's birth.
Oh, it's so interesting. This ballad discusses the possibility that Queen Jane underwent a cesarean section. So I think that is part of how we get that rumor that is how Prince Edward came to be and how he came into the world. This piece is really fascinating for a number of reasons. It appears in this kind of late 16th century book of ballads, something to do with the golden roses. I think I'll have to look it up for you, but it kind of has a telephonic presence from that point until the 20th century, when it kind of becomes and transforms with each century and each musical time period into this kind of 20th century folk song. So Joan Baez has done it now, which is really, really interesting too. But it's quite good.
Actually don't know if I've heard it. I'm going to need to listen to it immediately after this conversation.
Yeah, there's an article by Alistair Vannon in the Folk Music Journal talking about the historiography of the piece, and it's had several different names. The Woeful Death of Queen Jane. Okay, here it is. I found it was 1592 from a collection of ballads called The Crown Garland. And a lot of times you'll find that with ballads is that you'll find the text one place, and then it's just assumed that it was either sung from a tune you might have picked up from a ballad singer, or there was some kind of instrumental accompaniment that would have gone along with the piece.
So that's the earliest sort of date associated with this particular ballad. Right. And hence the story of the C-section was already doing the rounds at that point.
What's also interesting is that it kind of made the rounds, and it somehow was a super prominent ballad in Scotland, interestingly enough. So it wasn't as popular in the south of England, but it kind of, like I said, kind of traveled a bit, and there was a bit of a game of telephone with it. So it not only migrated north a bit, but it also passed through the centuries as well. And it talks about, there's about 8 verses talking about Henry VIII's experience, hearing about the birth of Prince Edward, and about the pain that Jane Seymour goes through in childbirth as well.
Do you want to mention now the song or the ballad associated with Anne Boleyn, that sometimes people say that she has written this herself? I've seen that written so many times. Oh, Death, Rock Me Asleep, which is beautiful. It's really haunting and beautiful. It's
beautiful. Do you have a favorite performance of it?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know now. I know I've heard several versions that are just stunning, really.
Oh, stunning. It's
Did you have one? You sound like you've got one.
Well, I think that there's one that Ala Mireille performed on the album, Anne Boleyn album. But honestly, Jay Britton, the Tudor songbook, she has a beautiful voice, and I love when she sings the piece too. So
it's so moving, isn't it? It's a really moving piece.
Yeah, and another Tudor musical mystery in this piece. And you're right, there's a bit of legend in this, and for a musicologist, it's also really interesting because it started appearing in all these kind of music history textbooks in the 70s that Anne Boleyn had composed this piece. And so I could find a handful of actual music history textbooks from the 70s and 80s that identify Anne Boleyn as the composer of this piece. And I think people they really want to believe that she's, while on death row in the captivity of the Tower, she just pulls out the quill and inkwell and just goes to town with this piece of music. So
yeah, I think it's because people are desperate for her to have had her chance to speak. Do you know what I mean? Like it's the same with the letter at the Tower, which I have to say my dear friend Sandra Vasoli does believe was in fact Anne's last words. So that's still open for debate. But I think it's the same sort of thing. We want her to have had the opportunity to have her say, because otherwise it's so unjust, right?
Yeah, I just got through rewatching. There's a little mini documentary on "Oh Death, Rock Me to Sleep" where a man called Martin Pope goes through the Tower, and he argues that, and they show several shots of him finding the poem in a manuscript at the British Library, but he doesn't identify the MS number or anything. And then Eric Ives kind of comes into the scene and says, actually she didn't have the opportunity to pen this work for obvious reasons. And there's no account of it from Master Kingston whatsoever, but it does appear the musical notation appears in several music manuscripts. There's one in the Hammond Part books that I actually found recently. So that's a 5-part book set. So there's actually 5 separate books that have parts or musical arrangements for just the music part, and it only says "Oh Death," so there's not really with the text at all. But there's a later manuscript, the English Songbook 1600 to 1675, Volume 6, where it actually is one of the first music manuscripts that includes both the text of "Oh Death, Rock Me to Sleep" with musical notation. But that's also quite a bit later, that kind of timeline.
So do you think that's when it dates from, the song dates from, or the music dates from the 17th century, do you think?
Yeah, I would guess it's probably turn of the century, honestly, because it's included that the one that's included that has text and music is in a collection of lute pieces by John Dowland. So I would guess it's around that time. And there's also this work, an Italian art song called Amarilli Mia Bella, which is a really famous kind of Italian art song that's also in that collection. But yeah, that would be my guess, is it's probably turn of the century, if not, as you say, 17th century. We can dream, though, can't we?
We can dream. And I recommend that if people haven't listened to it, that certainly, go and do that. You can just Google and it comes up on YouTube and all sorts of places, because it is very, very moving. So do you want to just tell us a little bit then about the tradition of execution balladry, and any specific ones that you've, kind of come across in your research?
Right. I feel that I have to give our listeners a bit of a trigger warning. These are not for the faint of heart, and definitely showcase a bit of England's more macabre and probably barbaric practices of public execution. So let's just put that out there. But a lot of this is from the work of Dr. Una McIlvena, who's just come out with a fantastic book on execution ballads throughout early modern Europe, 1500 to 1900. So it's a practice that went on quite a long time. But I think it is Susanna Lipscomb that mentions in her witch documentary that witch burnings were quite a holiday atmosphere. And yeah, execution ballads kind of play into that fact, because executions are the city or the community's Friday night football of the time. So there would have been snacks and so many people there, and vendors who would sell these ballads either about the crime that the perpetrator had committed, or later giving an account of the execution and how it went down. So they would sell these broadside ballads. They're kind of a larger sheet with lyrics. And then after a person might have purchased this ballad sheet, they would then go to what's called a ballad singer. So the words, the paper, and the song are a separate thing. So you go and at an execution, you might pick up an execution ballad, the sheet itself, and then later visit a ballad singer who might sing you the tune to it. And the tunes are quite simple and repetitive. So Greensleeves is one that they set many of the execution ballads to.
Right, okay, that's so interesting. And just remind me, because I wanted to ask you something about Greensleeves, but I'll do that after you.
Yeah. But I found a couple really interesting ones. And there were two separate ballads written for the conspirators of the Babington plot. So the first one was written in around 1586-ish, and it does talk about, and this is an execution that's a hanging, drawing, and quartering of 5 Catholic men, right? And they give those kind of details in the song. But what's interesting is that between that round of executions and that ballad and the second round is that the text changes a bit, because Queen Elizabeth decides to pardon the second round of conspirators. She decides to allow the executioner to hang them until dead before drawing and quartering. So the text talks about how merciful and good Queen Elizabeth is for allowing the conspirators to avoid that pain of death. But there's also a woman that's also executed in the second round. So that might have also had something to do with it. Yeah. So very, very grisly and
it's horrific, isn't it? It's so difficult for us to understand how this was a public event that people went to, as you say, where there were people selling snacks. Like, how can you eat a snack while you're watching someone be hung, drawn, and quartered? I can't possibly understand. But different times. That's really interesting what you say about buying the the sort of ballad and then having someone else sing it. That's fascinating. I'd never heard of that. So would there be people, in every local village that are the sort of ballad singer that you go to, or do you go to a pub, or where do you find these people?
Yeah, you go to a ballad singer, and they're very poor, itinerant musicians that are singing these tunes to the person who's bought or wants to learn the ballad, so that they can in turn go sing it at home if they want to, or sing it with their children if they want to. And the ballad tunes, again, they're simple enough that an untrained musician can pick it up quite easily in the streets, with probably much noise happening. So they're very redundant, very repetitive. The very small range, the melody has a really tiny range, or, like Greensleeves, very catchy, so that it's easy for people paying the ballad singer to catch on quite easily. But they were very poor people,
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And so Greensleeves, it's interesting that you brought it up. I just recently, just a couple of days ago, recorded a review of several episodes of The Tudors with my lovely friend, Dr. Owen Emerson. We always have such a good time. But in one of the episodes we were actually reviewing, Henry VIII is sitting there in his privy chamber, and he is, in fact, composing Greensleeves, and he's got the lute out. And I don't know if you remember Jonathan Rhys-Meyers doing that. I'd totally forgotten the scene. But of course, there's a lot of confusion as well about Greensleeves. Did he compose it? When did it come out? Who's it talking about? Why is she wearing green? All this sort of stuff. So have you come across anything to do with Greensleeves in your work?
No, not related to Henry VIII. The majority of what I've come across with Greensleeves has been with these ballads. And because that was such a typical ballad tune. Da, 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 da. And I think it was also related to that rhythm is either a galliard or a pavane. I can't remember, but it's one of those. So I think it was probably a dance tune that was popularized, and maybe the servants at Hampton Court Palace got an earworm with it, and then they in turn sang it, and it kind of disseminated into the Tudor public imagination.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Just, I don't know if this is the same in the US, Brooke, but when we don't really have them that often anymore, but ice cream trucks here in Australia had Greensleeves. That was the tune.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so fun. No, we have things like The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. So a lot of ragtime, that's really interesting. That's a great musicological course of study right there. Ice cream truck songs.
No, I have no idea why. I remember hearing that as a child and I loved it. And this is way before I ever came across Henry VIII or Anne Boleyn. And I just always think how funny it is that I've been listening to that for so long, not knowing what it was, until it kind of clicked it was quite a number of years ago now. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's Greensleeves that we're all humming.
It is beautiful. I mean, it's lovely, isn't it?
Oh, look, that's another one that if you haven't had a good listen to that, again, I do have a favorite version of that one, but I can't actually remember the person's name. It's on YouTube, so I might link it for everyone to listen to, but I could listen to that for hours on end, and I have done on repeat for a long time.
Yeah. No, it's great. There's no shame in that. There's no shame at all. It's beautiful music. It's obviously my favorite period in music history. Is I love a super moody, Tudor tune.
Absolutely. Well, this has been so interesting. Was there anything else that you wanted to tell us in terms of music and death and burials that I may have missed or that we've missed?
Well, like we've kind of touched on before, it's just this idea that music was so prolific in the Tudors' everyday life, and it was such an important part of this life transition and the ritual of death. And there was this kind of, again, this notion that with more singing, especially with a funeral procession, more singing of masses, that might shorten one's loved ones a period of time in purgatory. And so there is kind of this mutual relationship that happens between the aristocracy that's paying for the masses to be sung, and then the poor who are in turn attending and celebrating the mass, that if you're praying for a loved one or a stranger even soul to have less time in purgatory, then that in turn eliminates time for yourself to be in purgatory. So anyways, the prolificness of sound everywhere in Tudor life, it was everywhere.
It was everywhere. You're absolutely right. And even when, they're off traveling, the chapel choir goes with them, and it's a
Yes.
obviously reduced numbers, but they're there, aren't they? They're everywhere. And that is really important to keep in mind, I think. And there was something else you reminded me of when you mentioned the singing at that point in, when people are dying, that I was recently talking to Naomi Kelsey, which is an author who's written a wonderful book called The Burnings. I don't know if you've read it, but I highly recommend it. Great for October and Halloween, about the Berwick witch trials. And it just reminded me of one of the things that the women were accused of. And these women were again, very poor women, generally midwives or healers of some sort that were accused of witchcraft, very common. And one of the things they were accused of is the singing. They used to sing to their patients at the end, especially when their patients were dying or really unwell. And that was perverted to make it sound that, or to accuse them of having sung something that was, from the devil or something that killed them in the end. So this manipulation of this lovely thing that they were doing, which is just singing for their patients to make them feel better, was transformed into this awful act of having killed them through devilish words or devilish songs or tunes or something. So yeah, I found that really kind of disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah, it is disturbing. And this is the book that's sitting right here.
So Brooke's showing me the Salem Witchcraft Trials. Oh, that does look interesting.
Yeah, but there continues to be this kind of contentious relationship between women and music from 16th to almost to this 18th and early 19th century ideal of the ideal woman performing chamber music or just playing on the piano in the parlor. And so women continue for hundreds of years to have to walk this really fine line between the ideas of being overly seductive or bewitching or just enchanting men or a mixed audience. So between that and using music as a way to perhaps bring on a mate's attention and receive an advantageous marriage in that way.
Yeah, they're all good points. It was a fine line and a difficult position to walk. And we can see people like Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard getting, of course, caught out in that situation and having difficulty balancing those things where you're supposed to be this sort of untouchable, marble statue. But at the same time, you have to be at the center of this incredibly social court. So it's like, it's so hard.
And you have to play the game, don't you?
You do. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Brooke, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating discussion. If people want to kind of find out more about your work, what you're up to, where can they go?
Well, you can find me on Instagram at Lady Tudor Music is the best place. I'm also on Facebook, same name, same handle, Lady Tudor Music, but Instagram's usually the best place to reach out. Send me a DM or a question or smiley face.
Yeah, I have to say that's my favorite social media at the moment as well. So yeah, I recommend people jump on there. And you always post such interesting things. So highly recommend it. And I'll pop the link to your account in the show notes. But thank you once again for taking the time to talk Tudors with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie. It's always so great to be here and so great to talk with you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.